Hey everyone, welcome back to another special episode of The Making of a Nobody. It's a pleasure to have all of you here with us today as we continue to dig into the fascinating world of our chief nobody, Mark McNally. My name is Sejal Thakkar, and I'm the Chief Culture Officer at Nobody Studios. So, just to recap, in our first episode, we started peeling back some of the layers and went and took Mark all the way back to the beginning, from his early inspirations to his startup career that shaped the very foundation of Nobody Studios. And so, for those of you that weren't able to join us and missed the previous episode, I'm going to drop the link in the chat so that you can always go back. We put all of our live streams on the YouTube channel. So make sure you check out some of the other live streams and subscribe so that you get all of the new episodes that are going to be coming out. And then after the last episode, Mark, welcome to the show.
Sejal.
I got some great feedback. And so Min Bogata, actually, the director of Idea Lab, reached out to me and said, "Hey, why don't you ask people if they have questions for Mark?" And I was like, "That's awesome. I love it. So let's make it more interactive." So every show, we're going to start off and we're going to just ask people, "Do you have any questions for Mark on what we talked about during the last episode?" So for those of you that are joining us right now, if you have any questions bubbling up from the first episode about Mark's beginnings, about some of the wisdom the nuggets of wisdom that he shared with us, let's hear them. Put them in the chat, and we'll start going through them throughout the episode. If there's any right now, I can take a question, or I'll just go ahead and get started and keep a lookout on some of the questions that are coming in, because I think that's great. You've got Mark's attention for this hour. Let's take advantage of it. So, what do you think about that idea, Mark?
Let's go. I'm game.
All right. Okay, and so meanwhile, while we're waiting for people to get their hands all typing in the questions, I wanted to also share some feedback with you, Mark. I don't know if you saw some of the feedback that we got from our last episode or not, but it was really positive and inspiring. And so I wanted to just share a couple of the comments that I got back and give a shout out to Brian Kelly, who's the CEO and founder of Human Factors Consulting. He's actually a valued equity crowdfunder, a supporter of the studio. He's helped us in so many different ways. And I'm actually interviewing him on the live culture live stream show next week. And he wrote me a message saying, "Excellent first episode with Mark. Learning about Mark's journey and story and the Nobody Studio story has created greater connection with the mission and journey. Nicely done." Thank you, Brian. And then Karen Ziegler, who's kept our Idea Lab busy, another valuable contributor to our journey, sent me the following message. She said, "So good. Glad the studio is doing this. It's a powerful story, and I think it's very smart to get it out to the world in this format, and I look forward to tuning into the next one." So thank you again, Brian and Karen, for tuning in, and for everybody else that's tuning in and supporting us. I love that we're doing this live stream. And so, Mark, I was always curious, like what was the reason behind wanting to do this live stream and share your insights and journey in this format?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, I'm telling this story all day long, every day, but it's very often it's, one-on-one calls. I live in the Zoom world and the Google Meet world, and I'll go back to back to back. But, I have fantastic one-on-one conversations, but at the end of the day, I may have told my story to 10 people, 10 or 15 people. And you just realize that as you grow over time, not everybody has a chance to hear all the different parts of the story, right? And I'm sure we're going to talk about culture and some of other things today, but one of the things that happens when a company grows is as you start to grow and get different levels of management and new people, and at some point in the future there'll be 80% of the people will only been here like a year versus the original old guard. And as you get farther and farther away from the original founders, this is true for every startup, there's the high risk for dilution of message, dilution of purpose, dilution of vision, and it can be incredibly inefficient part of the startup process because you're going through such hyper growth. But it's nothing intentional. It's simply a matter you're not around those stories. You're not around the reasons, the whys. Sometimes the founders or the executives can be, the fact that they're a person, the fact that they have passions, the fact that there's something behind what we're doing can get lost as well. And so, yeah, I think it's just a recognition of the importance that everybody feels that connection to the whys and the reasons and even some of the lessons. And, when things start going well, it's really easy for people to forget how hard things were or how much effort or how much people had to put in to get something off the ground. And I just think it's an attempt here to make sure we capture it and institutionalize it for people to hear the stories and the philosophies.
Love it. I love it. And so look, questions are coming in already. So we got a question from Karen Z. How does your background in psych ops influence your decisions? Ooh, that's a good one, Karen.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, in the Army, that was my specialty, or one of my specialties was psychological operations. And the best way I think of it is it's like propaganda, leaflets, radio shows. It's really about winning the hearts and minds. I think that I was in a special operations command, so I got to do stuff that was fun, like jump out of planes and get deployed crazy places. But the specialty itself, I always said, is kind of like the marketing job of the military. So, you look at, hey, before you have to deploy force or before you have to, get aggressive in these situations, there's ways to talk, there's ways to communicate. And in the deployments that I was a part of, it meant, being on radio shows, talking to church leaders, talking to, local officials and mayors and government, and trying to craft a win-win. And I think it's true within marketing, but certainly the way I always looked at that job in the military was, it was your job to put yourself in the shoes of other people, right? It was your job to understand where they're coming from. It was your job to communicate what you were trying to communicate, but you could only do that effectively if you could first start by putting yourself in their shoes. So I think that's probably been something that's defined me in my life and career since, as I try to do that as much as possible.
Love it. Love it. All right. We'll take one more question before we get to our topic, which I'm excited to talk to you about today. This one is from Christian Oberstein, Oosterveen. What do you see other studios doing wrong? This is a big question. And how do you measure your own success? Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah. Great question. I don't really talk too much about what people I think are doing wrong, but I get the intent of that question. There's a lot of people trying to figure out the studio model. I mean, for us, we've got some strong opinions that you have to have time and capital constraints to build good companies. We've worked really hard to do something that was not all that easy, which was to make sure that when you're part of any one of our companies, you get equity across the entire portfolio. And we think that's a special part of what we do for our employees. And it builds a familial kind of culture that is really important, that everybody's in it together versus looking at each company independently. I think that's something special that we do. I think that sometimes people will look at how we are founders of the companies we create, which means we own a lot of the equity. Some studio models don't have a whole lot of equity or the same ratios of equity we do. And we think it's fundamentally part of what makes the model work. To put the amount of energy and effort that we do into the companies, and our entire executive team, the entire studio resources are aligned towards helping a company succeed, but not just giving mentorship or advice, but to roll up our sleeves and be founders with those companies. And so, that's an area that some people do it differently, but for us, we think it's a fundamental part of the success. And then how do I measure success? Like, at the end of the day, from an investment perspective, there's a financial measurement that is, black and white, but I usually don't talk about that too much. I mean, we will have, if we get this right, we're going to impact a whole bunch of founders in different parts of the world, and have a big impact on our employees, and our investors will see this as one of the best investments they've ever made. And so if we do all that, then we'll be doing just fine.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a big question. And I know we'll come back to that a little bit later on. And I'm going to actually say one more question here. This one from Min. This is a good one. I meant to ask you this last time, we ran out of time. But what did you learn from the startups that you had been on? Because I know you've been through 14 different startups, and you said some of them failed, some of them are still around. But the question he's asking is, what did you learn from the startups you had that failed? I love that question. That's a good one.
Well, a lot of lessons. I mean, you learn a lot from every experience, whether it succeeds or fails. One of the things that I did when I started the studio, or before the studio, is in order to craft the thesis that became the studio, I wrote down in a notebook, actually became 2 notebooks, every startup I've been a part of, even ones where I wasn't a leader, but I was an investor or a mentor. And I wrote down what we got right, what we got wrong, what held us back from becoming bigger, what forced us to fail, whatever the circumstance was, what were the personal lessons for me. And there was a lot of lessons that came out of that. But two big ones for me was, I found that people, when the people got wrong and the culture got wrong, it was always like universally the number one thing that hurt a company. That can also translate to a board. If you don't have a board that's well aligned and managed properly, boards can have a really negative effect sometimes on a company's path. In the same way, they can have a positive effect if you get it right. But yeah, I think when people, certainly earlier in my career, I was susceptible to getting excited about a person's resume, or they used to work at this company or that company, and that's going to look good, and I got past that pretty quick, and I spent a lot more time focusing on people's integrity, their character, their intestinal fortitude. How are they going to be when the chips are down? And I think that when you get the companies that were my most painful failures was when we hired just one or two people that fit in that kind of asshole category, and the whole culture got toxic, and people started looking over their shoulder, and the amount of energy that was going into politics and infighting versus building something, switched dramatically. And those were profound impacts on companies, just by having a couple of the wrong people in a leadership role. So it's one of the reasons why culture is so important to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, and that's a great segue into our topic. And keep those questions coming. If I don't get to them today, we're definitely going to get to them. I'll make note of all of these questions. But I just wanted to start off our topic. So today, I wanted to start off with this statistic. In a recent survey by Korn Ferry, they found that 72% of executives said that culture is a key component of organizational performance. And out of that 72%, they found that only 32% thought that their own organization was aligned with their business strategies and execution of their core values. And so I know we agree on this, Mark, that a company's culture reflects their core values in action, right? It permeates every aspect of their operations and how we interact with each other, how we treat our customers. And so for everybody that's joining in, over the next few live streams, you're going to get a front row seat where Mark and I are going to really uncover what I like to say is the very soul of our studio, our core values, right? These are our North Star, and they guide us in everything we do. And Mark started talking about this already. People first is one of our core values. And so, Mark, I refer to this core value as the beating heart of our studio, right? So can you share a little bit more about how you define this core value? And I know you were very adamant from the get-go when during our first conversation, I think we talked about this being one of our core values, people first.
Yeah. I mean, it's got many threads. It means a lot to me because it's got a couple of important threads. I think for one, certainly in my career, we've watched the boundaries and barriers between our professional and our work lives completely erode to nothing, right? I'm old enough to remember starting my career where, the important people had pagers, but, that usually didn't go off very often. And if it did, it was super important. But when you went home at the end of the day, that was your personal space. You weren't expected to reply to emails and text messages and stuff 24/7 like, we have become these days, right? Mm-hmm. And so for me, people first of all, acknowledges that our personal lives start to run into our professional lives on a daily basis, which means a different type of expectation of your colleagues, your coworkers, your employees, your leaders. There needs to be flexibility. There needs to be understanding. There needs to be compassion, empathy. People have to drop kids off at school. There's single mothers and single fathers that are out there navigating life. And, I just think that it's not like it was in the 80s or 90s when you could say, here's how it's going to be. Like, I just think that you create a culture that is, psychologically safe. Now, I also believe that there's a certain amount of accountability that goes with that. You also, we're not trying to create a culture where it's constantly warm hugs. We have to be accountable to perform and do our job with what our colleagues expect and the rest of our teams expect. But I think that's part of it. There's a couple other for me was, I've been a part of a lot of startups, and, I'm guilty in the past of saying what startup leaders say, which is, rallying the troops to work hard on a weekend or late nights, whatever. And the idea or the promise of a startup is that, hey, if you get this right, you're going to own an island someday, right? That's the kind of mantra. And it's reemphasized with the TV shows and other stuff that are out there, right? Or you look at the Elon Musks or the Zuckerbergs of the world, and that's what we're selling in this next generation of founders. But the reality is, it doesn't work that way most times for startup employees. Most startup employees don't understand cap tables, don't understand what their ownership is in a company, don't understand how, if the company sells for X amount or Y amount, what would actually come to them. And I think that if they did, most of them would quit their jobs and walk out the door, because they're buying into this concept that there's millions of dollars, at the end of the rainbow, but maybe at the end of a mid-sized exit, they're getting just a percentage of their annual salary. Like, that's really not a life-changing kind of event, right? Now, when I took my company public when I was in my 20s, my secretary or executive assistant, she became a millionaire, and I'm proud of that. But that's only happened once in 25 years. And so one of the things we tried to do early on, is why we share equity across the entire portfolio, is we want to make sure that the people who are our partners in building our companies have a lot more exposure to the upside. And that's something that's near and dear to my heart, just to make sure that I judge my success by, if I look at positively impacting people on a financial side in their lives and their trajectories, then I'll be just fine. And so that's where I focus.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, people first is really, it's not just important. It's really has to be the foundation, and that's what's going to drive us, to success, even to where we've gotten to this point. And so then I have a question here that came up from Kimberly, and she's saying, and I get that where this is coming from. I have been told that founders have big egos and often reject help that could dramatically increase their chances of success. What's your experience?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a stereotype, and stereotypes usually have some root in facts, right? It takes a certain amount of self-esteem and ego to go do something that's really gnarly when everybody's telling you it can't be done. Um, but I think I like to believe that my career has taught me a lot of humility. And I think that that's one of the most valuable traits of any leader. And, so I think certainly that can, sometimes be the case. But, one of the reasons, and it does dovetail into our people first strategy, which is we're called Nobody Studios for a reason. And people always ask me, but there's a few good reasons. But one of the biggest ones was that this is bigger than any one person, and so there's never going to be about an individual persona or ego. It's about, we've got a lot of really amazingly talented, accomplished people in the studio. And for that to work, you got to check your ego at the door. And I can't remember who was telling me this, but when we were telling that talk track to him, he said, yeah, when Michael Jackson did We Are the World, remember that song?
Mm-hmm.
And they had
Oh, yeah.
all these amazing singers and musicians in the room to record. He put the sign on the door that said, check your ego here. And, I just think that that's, a big part of creating the culture that we want, is that you can't let the ego dominate. And you also have to allow the other part of people first. For us is diversity of thought. And so if it's just the person who can speak the loudest, or the person who's most convincing, the person who makes the most in the room, you're not going to get the best ideas. And so that doesn't mean that you're not supposed to have passion. You're not supposed to argue for your ideas, but we certainly intend to, and always strive to continue to say, hey, if you got a good idea, bring it up, challenge it. Let's find the best idea. Not, it doesn't matter where it came from.
Yeah, no, that's the goal, right? Is to just ensure that every voice is heard, every perspective is valued, and that every individual feels seen and understood, right? And if we do that, then that's where we get that high performing team, the collaboration, the civility, and on and on and on. So I want to give credit where it's due to, is, making sure that our values that we're talking about, like people first, is an ongoing journey, right? And so I want to give a shout out to Blaine Bartlett, who worked with our leadership team a couple of times and really shared his valuable insights with us, gave us a deeper understanding of how we can live by our core values. And that translated into a recent team meeting that sparked a really powerful conversation in our studio about our core values. We had our core team come together to review, to clarify, to revise these definitions. And like every organization, we want to make sure that our core values reflect the evolving spirit of our team, right? And I'll say that, these aren't easy conversations to have, but it's moments like this that really highlight our commitment to doing that. And so here's the question. The next question I have for you, Mark, is the world is changing. It's changing so quickly. I mean, just in the last few years, we've gone through the pandemic. The studio was started in the pandemic, the civil rights movement, the ongoing political discourse, the rapid globalization. There's so much going on. It's like a whirlwind of change in the world and in our studio. So keeping our people first core value as the North Star requires intentionality, it requires effort. So how are you, if you could share some strategies of how you're making sure to keep that as central focus and not let it get overshadowed by some of the other priorities I know that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's for me, culture is like our chocolate covering. It's the chocolate wrapper around the nut that is the studio. I think we lead with it. I mean, it's on our website. It's we're getting something right, because when I talk to people for the first time, they'll be like, "I love what you guys stand for." Like, they're getting that from somewhere. They're getting it from our messaging. They're getting it from our site. I also think that when you lead with that type of messaging and it's wrapped around everything you try to do, you kind of solve the problem on the front end in terms of getting the right people in, because they're attracted to that, and it's become something, and you certainly said it to me dozens of times, but other people say it, investors will say it, where they'll be like, "You need to talk to so-and-so. They're a real nobody." Like, being a nobody somehow defines a certain type of character. Usually it is a high performer, an accomplished person, a passionate person, but they also have this ability to check their ego at the door with some humility and just work for a greater kind of outcome. So I think that's getting it right. And I think because it's weaved into everything we do, like, we literally see it as, we can't do what we're trying to do if we don't maintain this culture. I do think it pops up a lot. When the time, we haven't had a whole lot of like crazy conflicts, to be honest. We've been lucky with that, but we've had a few pop up, like any business. And it's usually been a moment where we've realized that, one of the people in that engagement really aren't buying into the culture. That's not how they're wired. They have a different mentality or a different approach. And, long term, that's probably not going to be a fit in the studio, to my previous point. Like, I will defend it, to the core. It doesn't always mean someone's, an asshole. It doesn't always mean that. It could be someone who is more of a spectator and isn't getting stuff done, or likes to talk but not do. Like, it means a lot of things around performance and trust and, getting stuff done and having fun along the way and being empathetic and, knowing how to be emotionally intelligent when you phrase things. And, yeah, I think it's just something we will always have to strive for and remind ourselves, but it's not a side thought for us. It is kind of the point.
Yeah, no. And I've seen it play out a number of times, right? Where we prioritize our team's well-being and diverse perspectives. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. But like our equity crowdfunding campaign, right? That's a great example of how our people first core values steered our decision-making, right? We knew that this initiative was not just about the financial outcome, but about the human implication of our decisions. And at the heart of that lies our commitment to diversity and inclusivity, right? We recognize that traditional funding venues or avenues often bypass individuals who share our vision, our passion, and ethos. So, Mark, can you share a little bit more about the reasons why the equity crowdfunding initiative was, I look at that as being a vital part of our People First core strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly about inclusivity, and we see everybody as being a part of the journey that wants to be on the journey. I'll tell for the listeners, like, crowdfunding's to this day is still not a very efficient place to go raise capital. It takes a lot of energy, effort, and money to raise the money that you do raise. So it's not actually, it wasn't for the capital we did it, for the amount of energy and effort we put into that. There's a lot of other ways and places we could have focused for capital raising. but we did it very intentionally because we wanted to have the network. We ended that crowdfunding event with thousands of investors worldwide, and we have their passions, we have their perspectives, we have their experiences, their ideas, their networks. They're part of our superpower. When you're going to say something like a big, hairy, audacious goal of like 100 companies in 5 years, and it's even more audacious if you ask me what we're going to do in 10 years. These big goals can't be done just by trying to be a couple of the smart guys in a room, smart people in a room, and so for us from the very beginning, we said there had to be a muscle that was built around the crowd. It's going to help you see things. It's going to help you move faster. It's going to help you test theories, pricing, branding. It's going to help you recruit great people. It's going to help you launch your companies. And even better if they're part of the equity upside of the financial returns we can create. So yeah, I'm proud of us doing that. It'll be something that we will continue to do, different parts of the studio or some of our companies. And I think that there's a new emerging class of investor that isn't going to be able to see the returns that they're used to anymore on the last 20 years of the stock market and mutual funds and stuff. And so they're going to have to kick in doors and get access to the upside. If you're a angel investor in Facebook, it's like a 4,000% return. I mean, it's not hard to be wealthy if you have access to that deal flow, but in the past it's been limited to only the very wealthy. And so I'm proud to be kicking in those doors.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on that thought, we now have, I think, over 1,000 new nobodies all over the globe, right? So it worked. We wanted diversity of thought and experience in our global studio, and there's been no question that it's contributed to our innovation and problem solving, right? So I would love for you to share some examples. I've got a couple that I'd like to talk about too, but I'd love for you to share some examples. You're in a lot more rooms than I am, so I want to pick your brain about where this has helped us innovate in totally different ways.
Well, look, I almost look at it as most of the folks, even our angel investors, but now our crowd investors, these are folks that we would be honored to work with, but probably couldn't afford if we, wanted to, right? And so in a way, it's like you've got this bench of a brain trust and consultants and advisors, and that almost any industry we want to get into or any city we want to operate in, we've got a cluster of investors that have deep experience there. So that's certainly been the number one thing, because that part that shows up in terms of if we want to pick their brain on an idea we have, or we're looking for an introduction to a partner, or any number of the things you have to do to make a company success. That access has been gold for us. And then I said, because I think the way we market ourselves and talk about ourselves, the types of people we've been able to interact with, they all feel like nobodies. They're leading with their heart. Certainly they want to see a financial return, but they want to make the world a better place. They believe in what we're trying to accomplish. And that's just made us, the whole experience richer for us. It's creating the family, it's creating our reach. I can certainly give examples down to each individual company level, but it happens every day, throughout the day. And it's, validates for us that this was, the reason why we did it.
Yeah, I mean, the equity crowdfunding campaign, again, great example of cross-functional, cross-cultural collaborations, right? I mean, our team, it just goes over and over again that the teams that we're putting together isn't just about the roles that individuals play, but it's about their stories, it's about their journeys. And like our marketing team collaborated with our tech team and got feedback from our core team, and we led to a campaign that resonated globally. Right. So it's because we put all those varied lenses together that it created a campaign that was holistic and relatable. Right. And so that's why we have and then the octopus movement. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I remember, our first conversation with the CEO, Perry Noppert. And I'll tell you, many CEOs would not even entertain that type of conversation. Right. It's a topic of, we want to bring all these different types of neurodiverse people into our studio. That's a conversation that a lot of people are shying away from. And all three of us during that conversation, I mean, I walked away feeling so proud after that, because we all knew it was something we wanted, maybe for different reasons, right? For me, I was like, I want to figure out a way for us to co-create because I want to bring more diversity into the studio, not just representational diversity, but also cognitive diversity. But maybe you could share a little bit more about that and how that supports our people first core strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I love, my experiences have given me a lot of things that I can teach and mentor people on. So I love teaching, but I love even more being taught. Like I love learning something new, right? And for the most part, that's going to be done and accomplished by exposing yourself to different types of people with different backgrounds, different passions, different reasons, different ways of thinking. I think that it's just a core belief of mine that makes me stronger, makes me better at my job, makes my life happier. So that's just an easy thing for me to be attracted to. Um, I always think that I'm fascinated with the idea of the non-obvious solutions or the non-obvious business models. And I think that most people in this space are kind of follow like sheep when you think of like, if you talk to a normal investor, you look at a normal, mutual fund, or you talk even to a VC and say, what areas you think are going to innovate. I mean, there's an 80-20 rule here. So there's definitely some exceptional thinkers, but I would say 80% of them have pretty mediocre, theories. Um, and so I'm always fascinated by finding that non-obvious thing that somebody wouldn't create on their own. And I just think that diversity is key to finding that. So, I'll usually start out. I always say I have strong beliefs loosely held. So, I have ideas, but I want to be challenged. I want to learn. I want to get to the right answer. And, I just fundamentally believe that, diversity gets you there.
Yeah, awesome. So you mentioned this earlier. This isn't easy work, people. So for everyone, it's like, it sounds wonderful that we've got this core value and we're doing all these initiatives. But as Mark mentioned, that there's challenges to doing that, right? When you have people that think differently from each other, there are going to be situations, no matter who the people are, no matter how great they are, where we may not see things eye to eye. And so is there an example, Mark, that you can share maybe, of a situation where there was a conflict or where there was a challenge? How was it approached and resolved in a way that aligned with our people first core value?
Yeah. So one of our other DNA principles is transparency. And, I can think of 3 or 4 scenarios where, you know, if you were to ask me the flip side of all this stuff we just talked about, right? What's the negative side? Then the intimacy and the friendships and the openness can sometimes blur the lines and make it hard to lead people, right? And it can be hard sometimes to coach people. And we try to be very transparent, but people can interpret that as, if you're transparent about all your decision making, then it's like a democracy, and it's hard to run a business like that. So I don't want people to think that that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to push the boundaries of that and get as far as we can with transparency and openness. But I would just say I can think of 3 or 4 examples where there was a behavior or a pattern of behavior that was just not constructive and was becoming toxic and becoming hard to work with a certain, different individuals. And I leaned into transparency because I'd realized that the relationship had become too personal, it had become a little bit too close, and it was going to be hard. But I said, look, this is my job. This is what you expect me to do. Your colleagues expect me to do. Investors expect me to do. So I'm just going to call it straight. And so I just talked transparently about the situation. And again, I think that because we have that culture, and I do believe people know that I'm coming from a good spot when I've ever had to have those conversations, people are able to absorb it and respond accordingly. So again, we've had a couple of situations happen even with an acquisition we were doing, and another thing with an investor where we just leaned into that. I mean, transparency has been one of the things that's been our consistent, value that saved the day when things are rough. You say, the truth is the truth. So let's talk openly. Let's not add any narrative to it. Let's not be toxic. But let's say, here's a situation. This is what we're feeling. This is what we'd like to see happen. And just talk transparently. And then people have what they need to solve the problem.
Love it. Love it. Look, we're almost at time, but I do want to ask this one question that just came in from Christian. Thank you, Christian. Love your comments. I'm glad you were able to join us. What tools are you using to measure a culture or to turn around a culture. Everyone can speak about a good culture, but only if you can turn it around when things get toxic.
Yeah, well, I agree. I certainly believe my philosophies about most things is you try to avoid the negative outcome as much as possible, because turning around anything when it's gotten bad is hard. Um, and so that's why we put so much energy into this. And Sejal will often say that I called her when I was still in my garage, and she could hear a dog barking in the backyard, and I was like, I need a cultural officer, and she's like, you have no employees. What are you, crazy? And I was like, yeah, but you don't know how big we're going to be, and culture is going to be the main thing. So I do believe by leading with it, that's one of our best things we can do. Now, unfortunately, sometimes in my experience, and there's no way I think around this, if you ever find yourself in a spot where culture has really become negative or in certain pockets, you usually need to clean house a little bit. Unfortunately, there's usually people who their part of the journey is over, and you need to transfuse it a little bit sometimes.
It's so true. And, Mark, I don't know if I ever shared this with you or not, but, a few weeks before you and I connected, I know I've shared this with some people at the studio and talked about it on my culture live stream, but a few weeks before you and I connected, I was on a podcast, and I tried to actually find it last night because I was like, I thought it would be kind of cool to play it during the show, but I couldn't find it. But I was on a podcast, and the podcast host asked me the question. They said, you work with a lot of companies after something goes wrong, like the culture is toxic, and now they call you in to do some training or some counseling or whatever, or as an employment lawyer, defend them. But what if you could start from the beginning and you can help build a culture from scratch? Like, would you want to do that? And like, I'd never thought about that question because, like I told you last episode, aside from me opening my own firm right now after my son was born because I wanted to be at home, I had no desire to start my own company, right? So I never really thought about it until that person asked me, right? And I just replied to that person. I said, sure. I mean, if I had the opportunity, I'd give it a try, right? And then literally, it was a couple of weeks after that you reached out to me, and you're like, well, culture is a priority for me. And by the way, we're not building one company, we're building 100. I was like, what? Like, talk about, did I manifest that? Or, the striking of just the timing of when it happened and the opportunity. And I just want to, again, just thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this journey. I am learning so much, and I'm truly humbled to be a part of this journey. So for everybody, we are at time. And if you're interested in learning more about who we are and what we're doing, we're going to need a lot of talent, a lot of influence, a lot of capital to build 100 companies. Join our journey. Mark, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off for today?
No, I just wanted to thank you, Sejal, and all that you brought to this journey. It's been a pleasure working with you and getting to know you, and you're a real star, and can't wait to see what else we're going to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We are back next week. We're going to go back to our usual time. So stay tuned for next week's event. And don't forget to have your questions ready. I love all the questions we got today. Keep them coming next time. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Bye.